Are you thinking about buying a renter occupied home? Perhaps you actually have a renter occupied home and you're wondering what it takes to sell it. Is it better to keep the tenant, to try and get them to vacate the premises? What's going to be more attractive to a buyer or a real estate investor? I'm Kaycee with Rentec Direct property management software. I'm also a landlord, a real estate investor, and I've been writing about property management and rental advice for over 10 years. Today, we're going to talk about what it takes to sell a rental or occupied home, what's going to be the most attractive to buyers, and what's the best way to handle your residents who are currently living in that property. Now, when I think about selling a renter occupied home, there's two things that you want to think about. You want to think about the tenant's perspective and also the seller and buyer's perspective. Now, as a buyer and a real estate investor, if I'm looking to purchase a rental property, buying a property that already has a tenant in it sounds great to me. That sounds like immediate cash flow. I'm not going to have to spend the time finding a new tenant. However, there are risks involved. I don't know anything about this tenant. I don't know their rental history. I don't know their rent payment history. So I'm really going to be relying on the seller to give me some insight on what that tenant is like. Also, we have to consider the lease term. A tenant is going to be contractually obligated to stay in that property for the entirety of their lease. If it's a term lease and a purchaser is coming in 6 months into that lease, they still have to honor that lease. Just because you're buying a property doesn't mean that the occupants have to leave. But if it's a month-to-month lease, you might have a little bit more flexibility if that tenant is going to be able to stay there once you purchase the property. It all depends on your state laws, remember. Now, when it comes to actually selling your renter occupied home, what's the best way to handle the tenants that are in it? You might have a tenant who is really cooperative with this situation, or you might have a tenant who isn't working out so well and doesn't want to let people into the house to handle maintenance or showings. The best course of action is to communicate and reassure that tenant. Having the knowledge that the property is going up for sale might be really scary for someone because that leads to housing uncertainty. I think it's always good to reassure the tenant that just because the house is going for sale doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have to find new housing. I found that to be really, really common that that's the assumption. Even when I'm buying a property that has a renter in it, that's always the first concern of the tenants when I meet them. They're like, oh my gosh, am I gonna have to move? And we always try and reassure them, like, not necessarily, let's keep talking about it. And it's so interesting that tenants have that perception that a new owner means that they're going to have to find new housing. So let's get back to that renter that's living in a property that's about to be sold. What's the best way to work with them? Now, as a seller, I'm going to want to make sure that house looks really good. So that might mean new maintenance, some fresh coats of paint, making sure the curb appeal is top notch. And of course, making sure that everything looks good on the inside. So that might mean maintenance personnel coming in a lot, real estate agents coming in to show the house. So we want to make that renter feel as comfortable as possible with that. Maybe you hire a cleaner and give that as a gift to the renter, that a housekeeper is going to come and do some house cleaning, getting the carpets cleaned. These can all be benefits to the renters, especially if you present it in a really attractive way to those tenants. And then something else that we really like to do, it's kind of our secret little way to really reward our tenants, is if we're planning showings for like a weekend, is offer to put them up in a hotel, get them movie tickets to get them out of the house for the day, restaurant gift certificates. These might sound like expenses on the seller's part, but if that means that your house gets sold faster, that is, I think, totally worth that return on the investment. Now, hopefully you have renters that are cooperative and they don't mind the showings, but sometimes you might not have renters who are cooperative. So they might want to be present at every single showing, every single time a maintenance personnel comes. And really, it's their right to be present. So the best thing I found to do is really work on that communication. Make sure you're following your state's rights or your state laws regarding notices to your tenants in terms of entering the house. Sometimes you can say, like a general term, you could do a notice that says, like, we're going to be doing maintenance work for this period of time. Try and do it all at once. You don't want to be having someone come every other Monday for a couple months or randomly for a couple weeks. That could be so inconvenient. You don't want to be inconvenienced at your home that way. So if you can kind of smush those people together, those maintenance personnel, do the showings all together, these are just ways that you can think about to be as accommodating to your tenant as possible, so they are as cooperative as possible to you, and you can hopefully get that house sold faster. Now, when it comes to buying a renter occupied property, some of the things that you want to think about is, I already mentioned, finding out from the seller any rental history you can about the tenant. You need to find out what kind of lease agreement is there. And ideally, when you take on the property, you can do your own tenant screenings, find out what their credit history is, find out any criminal background, because you want to know who's living in your property. And then also see if you can have them sign a new lease agreement with you. So then you're not assuming the lease agreement of the previous owner, but you are having your own lease agreement. Some other advice is to get an estoppel agreement, which really outlines the monies that have been transferred to you. So a security deposit that is transferred from a previous owner to the buyer, or does the security deposit go from the previous owner back to the tenant and then the tenant is paying it to you? So these estoppel agreements can kind of outline not only security deposits, but maybe any appliances that are in the properties that might belong to a tenant. And this all more comes down to when the tenant is moving out and they're not saying like, oh yeah, that washer and dryer is mine. And you're like, was it theirs, or did it come with the house? And so that estoppel agreement can really be helpful with that. So those are just some tips about what it takes when you're either buying a renter occupied home or when you're selling a renter occupied home. Communicate with your tenants, communicate with your real estate agent who's helping you sell it, communicate with the buyer's agent about what type of tenant you have. And if you're buying that renter occupied home, think about what you need to do in order to get the best return on that rental investment. I'm talking about tenant screening, that estoppel agreement that can help outline what money is owed, what appliances are part of the property versus what belong to the tenant, and transferring a lease agreement to you as soon as possible, or moving forward with getting a tenant to vacate the premise in the form of cash for keys and other incentives that might make it attractive for someone that you don't want living there to move out because it might not be a good fit for both of you. Hopefully that helps with some fun information about dealing with renter occupied homes when it comes to selling or buying a property. My name is Kaycee with Rentec Direct. Always happy to give you tips and advice when it comes to landlording, rental properties, and property management. You can find all this and more on the Rentec Direct blog. Come and check me out there, and I'll talk to you soon.